What could make God's chosen people turn their swords against each other? How did 12 tribes united under one God become two warring kingdoms? Here's what will blow your mind. The split happened in just one day. A single conversation destroyed centuries of unity. But here's the real mystery. Why did God allow his own people to destroy each other? Why didn't he stop the bloodshed? The answers will reveal shocking truths about human nature, divine justice, and the dangerous cost of pride. You'll discover how one king's foolish words triggered 200 years of civil war, how golden calves replaced God's temple, and why foreign armies succeeded where God's people failed. Ready to uncover the hidden reasons behind history's most tragic family feud? Solomon's kingdom looked amazing from the outside. Gold everywhere, beautiful buildings, and nations sending gifts. But behind all this glory was a painful truth. The people were suffering. The first book of Kings, chapter 4, tells us Solomon needed huge amounts of food every day. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 measures of fine flour and 60 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. Someone had to pay for all this luxury. The king forced people from all the tribes to work on his projects. According to 1 Kings 5:13-14, King Solomon raised a levy of forced labor from all Israel. The levy numbered 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Think about this. Fathers were taken away from their families for months at a time, just to cut down trees for the king's buildings. But it got worse. The people also had to pay heavy taxes. Every month, a different part of the country had to feed Solomon's huge household. Chapter 4 lists 12 officers who collected food from different regions. The burden was crushing ordinary families who could barely feed themselves. The temple construction required even more workers. 1 Kings 5:15-16 records. Solomon had 70,000 who carried burdens and 80,000 hewers of stone in the mountains, besides Solomon's 3,300 chief officers who were over the work and had charge of the people who did the work. That's over 150,000 people forced into hard labor. Years of this treatment built up anger in people's hearts. They loved God and wanted to build his house. But Solomon's methods were breaking their backs and their spirits. The seeds of rebellion were planted during these years of hardship. When Solomon died, everyone held their breath. Would his son Rehoboam be different? The northern tribes decided to test him. They chose Shechem, an ancient holy place, for the coronation. This wasn't an accident. Shechem was where Abraham first built an altar to God in the Promised Land. The people's request was simple and fair. 1 Kings 12:3-4 tells us, "And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, 'Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he put on us, and we will serve you.'" They weren't asking to overthrow the kingdom. They just wanted relief from the crushing burden Solomon had placed on them. They were willing to serve Rehoboam if he would just be more merciful than his father. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to think about it. This seemed wise at first. During these 3 days, he talked to 2 different groups of advisors. First came the old men who had served his father. These experienced counselors gave him smart advice in verse 7. "If you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever." These older men understood something important. A good king serves his people, not the other way around. They had seen how Solomon's harsh policies created problems, and they wanted Rehoboam to learn from those mistakes. But Rehoboam didn't like this advice. He wanted to show everyone how strong and powerful he was. So he turned to his young friends, guys who had grown up with him in the palace. These young men had never worked hard or struggled like ordinary people. They told him exactly what his pride wanted to hear. The 3 days were up. The people gathered at Shechem, hoping for good news, but what they heard shocked them. Rehoboam had chosen to follow the advice of his young, foolish friends instead of the wise elders. 1 Kings 12:13-14 records his harsh answer. And the king answered the people harshly, and forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him, he spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." Can you imagine how the people felt hearing these words? They had come humbly asking for mercy, and instead got threats of even worse treatment. Rehoboam was basically saying, "You think Solomon was tough? You haven't seen anything yet." The mention of scorpions was especially cruel. These weren't the animals, they were whips with metal pieces attached that would tear flesh when used. Rehoboam was promising to torture his own people into submission. But here's what Rehoboam didn't understand. You can't rule people through fear forever. His father's harsh methods had already pushed the people to their limit. Now, Rehoboam was threatening to make things even worse. The crowd's mood changed instantly. The hope in their eyes turned to anger. The respect they had for David's family was being destroyed by this young fool who cared more about showing off his power than caring for God's people. In just a few minutes, Rehoboam had thrown away decades of loyalty. His pride and the bad advice of his friends were about to tear apart the kingdom his grandfather David had built with such care. But God had already been working behind the scenes. Years earlier, when Solomon was still alive, there was a man named Jeroboam who worked for the king. He was talented and hard-working, and Solomon put him in charge of all the forced labor from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. One day, as 1 Kings 11:29-31 tells us, something amazing happened. And at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him on the road. Now Ahijah had dressed himself in a new garment, and the two of them were alone in the field. Then Ahijah laid hold of the new garment that was on him, and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I'm about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes." This was God's way of showing Jeroboam what would happen. The torn robe represented the 12 tribes, and 10 pieces going to Jeroboam meant he would rule most of the kingdom. The prophet explained that this was happening because Solomon had turned away from God to worship other gods. But there was a problem. Solomon found out about this prophecy. 1 Kings 11:40 says, "Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, to Shishak king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon." Jeroboam had to run for his life and hide in Egypt. Now, with Solomon dead and Rehoboam making terrible decisions at Shechem, the time was right. Jeroboam came back from Egypt at exactly the right moment. The people who were angry with Rehoboam suddenly had someone else they could follow. Someone who understood their suffering because he had been in charge of their forced labor. God's timing was perfect. Just when the people needed a leader to stand up to Rehoboam's threats, Jeroboam appeared. The prophecy Ahijah had given years before was about to come true. When the people heard Rehoboam's cruel threats, their patience finally snapped. They had tried to be reasonable, asking nicely for relief from their burdens. Instead, they got promises of even worse treatment. It was the last straw. 1 Kings 12:16 captures the moment when everything changed. And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David." These weren't just angry words. They were a complete rejection of David's family line. The people were saying they no longer wanted anything to do with the house of David. "To your tents, O Israel," was like saying, "We're done with you, we're going home." The rebellion happened incredibly fast. One moment, Rehoboam thought he was about to be crowned king over all 12 tribes. The next moment, 10 tribes were walking away from him, all because of a few foolish words spoken in pride. The northern tribes immediately turned to Jeroboam. Here was a man who understood their struggles, who had worked alongside them during Solomon's harsh labor projects. He knew what it felt like to be pushed around by an uncaring king. As verse 29 tells us, "And when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David but the tribe of Judah only. In one day, the united kingdom was gone." David had spent years bringing the 12 tribes together under one crown. Solomon had made the kingdom rich and powerful. But Rehoboam destroyed it all with his arrogant words and foolish pride. The people weren't rebelling against God. They were rebelling against a king who threatened to treat them like slaves instead of like human beings made in God's image. Rehoboam was shocked. He couldn't believe what had just happened. In his mind, he was the rightful king of all Israel, and these people were just rebels who needed to be put in their place. He decided to use the one tool he understood: force. His first move was to send Adoram, the man in charge of forced labor, to bring the northern tribes back under control. This was probably the worst person he could have chosen. And Kings 12:18 tells us what happened. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was taskmaster over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. Think about this choice for a moment. Adoram was the symbol of everything the people hated about Solomon's reign. He was the one who had forced their fathers and brothers into back-breaking labor. Sending him to negotiate was like poking an angry bear with a stick. The people's reaction was swift and violent. They killed Adoram with stones, showing just how much they hated what he represented. This wasn't just anger at one man. It was years of built-up rage finally exploding. The verse continues, "And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem." The king barely escaped with his life. He had to run away like a criminal, jumping in his chariot and racing back to the safety of his own city. This failed mission made everything worse. Instead of showing strength, Rehoboam had shown that he was weak and out of touch. Instead of bringing the tribes back together, he had driven them further away. The blood of Adoram was now between them, making any peaceful solution much harder. The northern tribes saw that Rehoboam would rather use violence than listen to their concerns. This convinced them they had made the right choice in rejecting him. There was no going back now. What had been one nation under God was now two separate kingdoms. The division was complete and shocking. Jeroboam ruled the northern 10 tribes from his capital in Shechem, while Rehoboam controlled only Judah and Benjamin from Jerusalem. The split wasn't just political, it cut right through families and friendships. Brothers who had fought side by side in David's army now found themselves on opposite sides of a border. Towns that had traded freely with each other were now in different countries. Kings 12:21 shows us how serious this division was. When Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. Rehoboam was preparing for war against his own people. He gathered almost 200,000 soldiers, ready to force the northern tribes back under his control through violence. The kingdom that David had built through unity and God's blessing was about to be torn apart by civil war. But the tragedy went deeper than politics. This split was also God's judgment on Solomon's unfaithfulness. 1 Kings 11:11-13 had warned this would happen. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son." Solomon's worship of other gods had consequences that reached beyond his own life. His son was paying the price for his father's spiritual failures. The kingdom was being torn apart exactly as God had warned. Now Israel had two kings instead of one, two capitals instead of one, and soon there would be two different ways of worshiping God. The unity that had made Israel strong was gone. Just when it looked like the situation couldn't get worse, God stepped in. Rehoboam was ready to march north with his huge army and force the rebellious tribes back under his control. Civil war seemed certain. Brother would fight brother, and the promised land would be soaked in Hebrew blood. But God had other plans. He sent a prophet named Shemaiah to stop the war before it started. 1 Kings 12:22-24 records this crucial moment. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. Say to Rehoboam the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your brothers, the sons of Israel. Every man return to his home, for this thing is from me. God's message was clear and shocking. He called the northern tribes your brothers. They weren't enemies to be destroyed, but family members who had been driven away by foolish leadership. More importantly, God said, this thing is from me. The division wasn't just human politics gone wrong, it was part of God's plan. This must have been hard for Rehoboam to hear. He probably expected God to support his right to rule all 12 tribes. Instead, God was telling him to accept the division and go home peacefully. But here's something amazing. They obeyed. The last part of verse 24 says, so they listened to the word of the Lord and went home again according to the word of the Lord. 180,000 armed warriors, ready for battle, simply laid down their weapons and went home because God said so. This showed that despite all the political chaos, there were still people in both kingdoms who respected God's word. They chose to obey the Lord rather than follow their natural desire for revenge and conquest. The immediate crisis was over, but the damage was done. The kingdom was split, and it would stay that way for centuries to come. Jeroboam had won the political battle. 10 tribes followed him as their king, and he ruled from his new capital in Shechem. But late at night, when the celebrations were over, a troubling thought kept him awake. What would happen when the people went to worship? You see, God had commanded all Israelites to come to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the great festivals. Even though the kingdom was now split politically, God's law hadn't changed. The temple was still in Jerusalem, in Rehoboam's territory. This meant Jeroboam's people would have to cross the border and enter his enemy's land to worship God properly. First, Kings 12:26-27 shows us exactly what worried Jeroboam. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam king of Judah. Think about this fear from Jeroboam's point of view. Every few months, thousands of his people would travel to Jerusalem. They would see the beautiful temple, remember the glory days of David and Solomon, and maybe start thinking that splitting the kingdom had been a mistake. Worse, they might decide that God was really on Rehoboam's side since he lived in the temple. In Jerusalem, what if families started talking during these trips? What if they began to regret leaving Rehoboam? What if some of the northern tribes decided to switch sides? Jeroboam could picture it all too clearly. His own people turning against him and maybe even killing him to get back in Rehoboam's good graces. This fear ate at Jeroboam day and night. He had worked so hard to become king, and now it felt like his throne could disappear every time his people went to worship. But instead of trusting God, who had made him king in the first place, Jeroboam decided to take matters into his own hands. He began planning something that would solve his political problem, but create a spiritual disaster that would last for centuries. Fear was about to make him do something that would break God's heart and destroy his own soul. Jeroboam came up with what he thought was a brilliant solution. If he couldn't stop his people from wanting to worship, he would give them somewhere else to worship, right in his own kingdom. But this wasn't going to be just any worship. Jeroboam was about to make one of the most tragic mistakes in Israel's history. The king called his best craftsmen and ordered them to make 2 golden calves. These weren't small statues. They were large enough for people to see from a distance, impressive enough to compete with the temple in Jerusalem. When the calves were finished, Jeroboam placed one in Dan, at the very northern tip of his kingdom, and the other in Bethel, near the southern border. 1 Kings 12:28-29 tells us what happened next. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and he said to the people, "You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Can you hear the lies in Jeroboam's words? First, he told the people they had been going to Jerusalem long enough, as if worshipping God in his chosen place was some kind of burden they could just stop doing. Second, and much worse, he called these golden calves your gods, and claimed they were the ones who had brought Israel out of Egypt. This was exactly what the Israelites had done in the wilderness when Moses was on Mount Sinai. Back then, they had made a golden calf and said the same words, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." God had been furious then, and he was furious now. Jeroboam's plan was clever from a political standpoint. Dan and Bethel were at opposite ends of his kingdom, so people from anywhere in the northern tribes could easily reach one of them. They wouldn't have to make the long, dangerous journey to Jerusalem anymore, and they certainly wouldn't have to enter Rehoboam's territory and risk switching sides. But Jeroboam had made a fatal mistake. He was treating worship like a business decision, as if the location and method of worship didn't matter to God. He thought he could just create his own religion to serve his political needs. The people should have refused. They should have remembered what happened to their ancestors who worshipped the golden calf in the wilderness. But instead, verse 30 tells us the tragic truth. Then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to worship the one there. The golden calves were just the beginning. Jeroboam quickly realized he had another problem. He didn't have any priests. All the real priests were from the tribe of Levi, and most of them stayed loyal to the temple in Jerusalem. After all, that's where God had chosen to put his name, and that's where he had commanded them to serve. So Jeroboam decided to make his own priests. This wasn't just bending the rules a little, this was completely throwing out God's clear commands about who could serve as priests. According to 1 Kings 12:31, he also made houses on high places and appointed priests from among all the people who were not of the Levites. Think about how shocking this was. God had specifically chosen the tribe of Levi to be his priests. He had given detailed instructions about how they should be trained, what they should wear, and how they should conduct worship. These weren't suggestions, they were direct commands from the creator of the universe. But Jeroboam didn't care about God's commands. He cared about keeping his kingdom together. So he basically put up a "Help Wanted" sign and hired anyone who obliged. It didn't matter what tribe they came from or whether they knew anything about God's laws. If they were willing to serve at his golden calves, they were hired. 2 Chronicles 11:13-15 gives us more details about what happened. And the priests and the Levites, who were in all Israel, presented themselves to him from all places where they lived. For the Levites left their common lands and their holdings and came to Judah and Jerusalem, because Jeroboam and his sons cast them out from serving as priests to the Lord. And he appointed his own priests for the high places, and for the goat, idols, and for the calves that he had made. This tells us that Jeroboam didn't just ignore the real priests, he actually kicked them out. The Levites who wanted to stay faithful to God had to leave their homes and move to Judah. Imagine having to choose between your job and your faith, between staying in your hometown and obeying God. Meanwhile, Jeroboam's new priests had no training, no understanding of God's holiness, and no respect for his laws. They were just political appointees, doing whatever the king told them to do. This fake priesthood would lead Israel further and further away from the true God. Jeroboam wasn't finished yet. He had created fake gods and fake priests, but he still had one more problem. The people were used to celebrating God's festivals at specific times of the year. If they kept following God's calendar, they might remember that these celebrations were supposed to happen in Jerusalem, at the real temple. So Jeroboam decided to change God's calendar too. 1 Kings 12:32-33 describes his next act of rebellion. And Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he had made. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, in the month that he had devised from his own heart, and he appointed a feast for the people of Israel, and went up to the altar to make offerings. Notice those important words, in the month that he had devised from his own heart. God had commanded that the Feast of Tabernacles should be celebrated in the 7th month, but Jeroboam moved it to the 8th month just because he felt like it. This might seem like a small change, just shifting a festival by 1 month, but it showed something terrible about Jeroboam's heart. He thought he could improve on God's plan. He thought his ideas were better than God's commands. The Feast of Tabernacles was supposed to remind the people how God had taken care of them in the wilderness. It was a time to remember his faithfulness and give thanks for his provision. But Jeroboam turned it into a celebration of his own golden calves. Even worse, Jeroboam didn't just change the date. He performed the ceremonies himself. The text says he went up to the altar to make offerings. But Jeroboam wasn't a priest. Only priests from the tribe of Levi were supposed to offer sacrifices. By doing this, Jeroboam was claiming to be prophet, priest, and king all at the same time. The people should have been horrified. They should have remembered that when King Saul tried to offer sacrifices, God rejected him as king. But instead, they went along with Jeroboam's fake festival, celebrating at the wrong time in the wrong place to the wrong gods. God had been watching all of this rebellion, and his patience was running out. Jeroboam thought he had solved all his problems with his fake religion, but he was about to discover that you can't fool the Almighty. On the day of Jeroboam's fake festival, as the king stood at his altar in Bethel burning incense to his golden calf, something amazing happened. 1 Kings 13:1-2 tells the story. And behold, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel. Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make offerings, and the man cried against the altar by the word of the Lord, and said, O altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you. Picture this scene. Jeroboam is in the middle of his big ceremony, probably feeling pretty proud of himself. Hundreds of people are watching him offer incense to his golden calf. Everything seems to be going perfectly. Suddenly, a stranger appears, a prophet from Judah, from Rehoboam's kingdom. This man walks right up to Jeroboam's altar and starts prophesying against it. He's not talking to Jeroboam. He's talking to the altar itself, as if it's a living thing that needs to hear God's judgment. The prophecy was specific and shocking. A future king named Josiah from David's family line would one day sacrifice the false priests on this very altar and burn human bones on it. This was God's way of saying that this fake worship wouldn't last forever. One day, divine judgment would come, but the prophet wasn't finished. Verse 3 continues, "And he gave a sign the same day, saying, 'This is the sign that the Lord has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out.'" A sign. The prophet was going to prove that his words came from God by making something happen right now in front of everyone. This wasn't just a prediction about the distant future. This was an immediate demonstration of God's power. Can you imagine the tension in the air? Everyone was staring at the altar, waiting to see if the prophet's words would come true. Jeroboam's entire fake religion was about to be tested in front of all his people. Jeroboam was furious. Here, he was trying to conduct his important religious ceremony, and this prophet from enemy territory was ruining everything. The king's first instinct was to use force to solve his problem. 1 Kings 13:4 describes what happened next. When the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, "Seize him." And his hand, which he stretched out against him, dried up so that he could not draw it back to himself. In that instant, everything changed. Jeroboam reached out to grab the prophet or to order his guards to arrest him, but his hand immediately became withered and useless. He couldn't even pull it back to his side. The king, who thought he was so powerful, couldn't even control his own arm. At the same moment, verse 5 tells us, the altar also was torn down, and the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign that the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. The altar split apart, just as the prophet had predicted, and all the ashes from Jeroboam's sacrifices spilled onto the ground. Picture the shock on everyone's faces. The altar they had been worshipping at was broken in pieces. Their king was standing there with a withered hand, helpless and humiliated. And the prophet from Judah was standing calmly in the middle of it all, completely unharmed. This was God's way of showing everyone who really had power. Jeroboam could make golden calves and fake priests and false festivals, but he couldn't stand against the true God of Israel. His fake religion was literally falling apart in front of everyone's eyes. Suddenly, Jeroboam's attitude completely changed. Verse 6 shows us his desperate plea. "And the king said to the man of God, 'Entreat now the favor of the Lord your God, and pray for me that my hand may be restored to me.' And the man of God entreated the Lord, and the king's hand was restored to him and became as it was before." Notice that Jeroboam called God the Lord your God, not my God or our God. Even in his moment of need, he still wasn't ready to fully acknowledge the God he was rebelling against. But the prophet was merciful. He prayed for Jeroboam, and God healed the king's hand immediately. This was grace that Jeroboam didn't deserve, a demonstration of God's mercy even to those who rebel against him. You would think this amazing demonstration of God's power would end the story perfectly. The prophet had delivered his message, proved God's power, and even shown mercy to the rebel king. But what happened next shows how dangerous it can be to disobey God, even in small things. Jeroboam was so impressed by what he had seen that he invited the prophet to come home with him for a meal. 1 Kings 13:7 records his offer, "And the king said to the man of God, 'Come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward.' But the prophet refused, explaining the instructions God had given him in verse 9. For so was it. Commanded me by the word of the Lord, saying, 'You shall neither eat bread nor drink water, nor return by the way that you came.'" God had told him to deliver the message and leave immediately, without accepting any hospitality or even taking the same road home. So the prophet started his journey back to Judah, taking a different route, just as God had commanded. Everything should have been fine. But there was an old prophet living in Bethel who heard about what had happened at the altar. This old prophet was curious about the man from Judah. According to verses 11 to 18, he saddled his donkey and rode after the young prophet. When he found him resting under a tree, he invited him back to his house for a meal. When the young prophet explained that God had forbidden him to eat or drink in this place, the old prophet told a terrible lie. Verse 18 records his deception. And he said to him, I also am a prophet as you are, and an angel spoke to me by the word of the Lord, saying, Bring him back with you into your house, that he may eat bread and drink water. But he lied to him. The young prophet believed this lie and went back to eat with the old prophet. But during the meal, God spoke through the old prophet himself, delivering a shocking message in verses 21 to 22. And he cried to the man of God who came from Judah, Thus says the Lord, because you have disobeyed the word of the Lord and have not kept the command that the Lord your God commanded you, but have come back and have eaten bread and drunk water in the place of which he said to you, Eat no bread and drink no water, your body shall not come to the tomb of your fathers. The very man who had lied to the prophet was now prophesying his death for disobedience. It was a tragic irony. The old prophet had caused the problem, but God still used him to announce the judgment. Sure enough, verse 24 tells us what happened. And when he had gone, a lion met him on the road and killed him, and his body was thrown in the road, and the donkey stood beside it. The lion also stood beside the body. This wasn't a normal lion attack. The lion didn't eat the prophet or hurt the donkey. It just killed the man and then stood guard over the body, as if it were following specific orders from God. You would think that after seeing his altar destroyed, his hand withered and healed, and a prophet killed for disobedience, Jeroboam would finally get the message. God had shown his power in the most dramatic ways possible. Any reasonable person would have repented and turned back to the true worship of God. But Jeroboam's heart was already too hard. 1 Kings 13:33-34 tells us the tragic ending. After this thing, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but made priests for the high places again from among all the people. Any who would, he ordained to be priests of the high places. And this thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and to destroy it from the face of the earth. Even after everything he had seen, Jeroboam went right back to his fake religion. He kept making priests from ordinary people instead of Levites. He continued worshipping his golden calves. He kept celebrating his fake festivals at the wrong times. This wasn't just stubbornness, this was spiritual blindness. Jeroboam had seen God's power with his own eyes, felt it in his own body, but he still chose to rebel. His political fears were stronger than his reverence for God. The text says, this became sin to the house of Jeroboam. It wasn't just Jeroboam who would pay for this rebellion. His entire family line would be destroyed because of the choices he made. His descendants would suffer for his stubborn refusal to repent. But the damage went far beyond Jeroboam's family. His fake religion became the template for every evil king who came after him in the northern kingdom. For the next 200 years, the Bible would repeatedly say that kings walked in the way of Jeroboam, or did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam. What started as a political solution to keep his people from going to Jerusalem became a spiritual cancer that infected Israel for generations. Jeroboam's golden calves would lead the northern tribes further and further away from God, until finally God allowed them to be conquered and scattered by the Assyrians. All because one king chose his political fears over faith in the God who had made him king in the first place. The prophet Shemaiah had stopped the first civil war, but he couldn't stop the hatred that was growing between the two kingdoms. What had started as a family argument was turning into something much worse. a blood feud that would last for generations. 1 Kings 14:30 tells us the sad truth. And there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all their days. This wasn't just one big battle that settled everything. This was constant fighting, year after year, with raids and border skirmishes that never seemed to end. Think about what this meant for ordinary families. Farmers couldn't work their fields safely because enemy soldiers might attack at any time. Merchants couldn't travel freely between the kingdoms to trade their goods. Children grew up hearing stories about their enemies in the other kingdom, people who used to be their cousins and friends. The border between Judah and Israel became like a scar across the Promised Land. Towns that had once welcomed travelers from anywhere in Israel now had to decide which kingdom they belonged to. Families were split apart, with some members living in Judah and others in Israel, unable to visit each other safely. Both kingdoms had to spend huge amounts of money on armies instead of building schools, fixing roads, or helping the poor. Soldiers, who should have been farming or working as craftsmen, were instead carrying swords and shields, always ready for the next battle. The fighting also made both kingdoms weaker against outside enemies. Instead of working together like they had in David's time, the Hebrew kingdoms were wasting their strength fighting each other. Foreign nations were watching this civil war and planning how they could take advantage of it. 2 Chronicles 12:15 sums up those early years. Now, the acts of Rehoboam, from first to last, are they not written in the chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there were wars between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. The word continually shows just how constant this fighting was. What made it even sadder was that both sides were losing. Every battle, whether Judah won or Israel won, meant that Hebrew blood was being spilled by Hebrew hands. The people who were supposed to be God's chosen nation were destroying each other instead of being a light to the world. While the Hebrew kingdoms were busy fighting each other, a much bigger threat was growing in the south. Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt had been watching the civil war with great interest. He remembered the days when Egypt ruled over the land of Canaan, and he saw an opportunity to get some of that power back. In the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, while Judah and Israel were still fighting each other, Shishak made his move. 2 Chronicles 12:2-3 describes the invasion. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, and the people were without number who came with him from Egypt, Libyans, Sukiites, and Ethiopians. This was a massive army, bigger than anything either Hebrew kingdom could fight alone. Shishak brought soldiers from all over North Africa, not just Egypt. The 200 chariots alone would have been terrifying to people who were used to fighting on foot with swords and spears. But here's the tragic part. If Judah and Israel had still been united, they might have been able to stop this invasion. David and Solomon had defeated much larger armies when the 12 tribes fought together. But now, instead of helping each other, the Hebrew kingdoms were too busy fighting each other to notice the real danger until it was too late. Shishak's army swept through Judah like a flood. 2 Chronicles 12:4 tells us, "And he took the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem." All of Judah's defenses, built over many years, fell one by one. The cities that should have protected Jerusalem were captured, leaving the capital exposed. When Shishak finally reached Jerusalem, Rehoboam had no choice but to surrender. The prophet Shemaiah came to the king with a message from God in verse 5. Then Shemaiah the prophet came to Rehoboam and to the princes of Judah who had gathered at Jerusalem because of Shishak, and said to them, "Thus says the Lord, you abandoned me, so I have abandoned you to the hand of Shishak." God was allowing this invasion as punishment for Judah's unfaithfulness. But when Rehoboam and his officials humbled themselves, God showed mercy. He promised that Jerusalem wouldn't be completely destroyed, but there would still be a heavy price to pay. Verses 9 to 11 describe what happened next. So Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away the shields of gold that Solomon had made, and King Rehoboam made in their place shields of bronze, and committed them to the hands of the officers of the guard, who kept the door of the king's house. And as often as the king went into the house of the Lord, the guard came and carried them and brought them back to the guardroom. All the gold that Solomon had used to make the temple beautiful was gone. The golden shields that had shown Israel's glory were replaced with cheap bronze copies. Egypt had robbed God's house while his people were too busy fighting each other to protect it. When Rehoboam died, his son Abijam became king of Judah. You might think that after Egypt's devastating invasion, both kingdoms would realize they needed to stop fighting each other. But the hatred had grown too deep. The civil war continued into the next generation. Jeroboam gathered a huge army of 800,000 men to fight against Judah. But Abijam could only muster 400,000 soldiers. The odds were 2-1 against Judah, and it looked like Israel was about to win a crushing victory. But before the battle began, something remarkable happened. 2 Chronicles 13:3-4 tells us, Abijam went out to battle with an army of valiant men of war, 400,000 chosen men, and Jeroboam drew up his line of battle against him with 800,000 chosen mighty men. Then Abijam stood up on Mount Zemaraim, that is in the hill country of Ephraim, and said, "Hear me, Jeroboam, and all Israel." Abijam climbed up on a mountain where both armies could hear him, and he gave one of the most powerful speeches in the Bible. This wasn't just political trash talk before a battle. This was a theological argument about which kingdom was really following God. Abijam started by reminding everyone of God's promises in verse 5. Ought you not to know that the Lord God of Israel gave the kingship over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt? A covenant of salt meant a permanent, unbreakable promise. God had chosen David's family to rule, not Jeroboam's. Then Abijam got to the heart of the problem in verse 8. And now you think to withstand the kingdom of the Lord in the hand of the sons of David, because you are a great multitude, and have with you the golden calves that Jeroboam made you for gods. This was a direct attack on Jeroboam's fake religion. Abijam was saying that Israel wasn't just rebelling against Judah. They were rebelling against God himself by worshipping those golden calves. But Abijam wasn't finished. In verses 9 to 11, he contrasted the two kingdoms' worship. Have you not driven out the priests of the Lord, the sons of Levi, and made priests for yourselves like the peoples of other lands? Whoever comes for ordination with a young bull and 7 rams becomes a priest of what are no gods. But as for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not abandoned him. We have priests ministering to the Lord who are sons of Levi, and Levites for their service. They offer to the Lord every morning and every evening burnt offerings and incense of sweet spices, set out the showbread on the table of pure gold, and care for the golden lampstand that its lamps may burn every evening. For we keep the charge of the Lord our God, but you have abandoned him. This speech turned the coming battle into something much bigger than a political fight. Abijam was saying this was a war between true worship and false worship, between obedience to God and rebellion against him. After Abijam finished his speech, you might think Jeroboam would have been ashamed and called off the battle. Instead, the northern king decided to use a sneaky military trick. While Abijam was talking, Jeroboam quietly sent part of his army around behind Judah's forces. 2 Chronicles 13:14 describes what happened. Jeroboam had sent an ambush around to come upon them from behind. Thus his troops were in front of Judah, and the ambush was behind them. And when Judah looked, behold, the battle was in front and behind. And they cried out to the Lord, and the priests blew the trumpets. Suddenly Judah was trapped. They had enemies in front of them and enemies behind them, with nowhere to run. Any military expert would have said Judah was doomed. But instead of panicking, they did something that showed their faith was real. They cried out to God for help. The priests blew their trumpets, not to signal retreat, but to call on the Lord to fight for them. This was the same kind of faith that Joshua had shown at Jericho, trusting God to win impossible battles. And God answered their prayer in an amazing way. Verse 15 tells us, "Then the men of Judah raised the war cry, and when the men of Judah raised the war cry, God defeated Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijam and Judah." Notice that it says God defeated Israel, not Judah defeated Israel. This was clearly a supernatural victory. When Judah's soldiers shouted their battle cry, God himself joined the fight on their side. The results were devastating for the northern kingdom. Verse 17 gives us the shocking numbers. Abijam and his people struck them with great force, so that 500,000 chosen men of Israel fell slain. 500,000 soldiers from Israel died in one battle. This was one of the bloodiest days in the history of the Hebrew people. Verse 18 explains why this happened. Thus the people of Israel were subdued at that time, and the people of Judah prevailed because they relied on the Lord, the God of their fathers. The key was that Judah relied on the Lord, while Israel relied on their golden calves and fake priests. But this victory came at a terrible cost. Yes, God had shown his power and defended those who trusted in him, but 500,000 Hebrew men were dead, men who had wives and children waiting for them to come home. The civil war had reached a new level of tragedy, with entire generations wiped out in a single day. Jeroboam never recovered from this defeat. Verse 20 tells us, "Jeroboam did not recover his power in the days of Abijam, and the Lord struck him down, and he died." The king who had led Israel into idolatry was finally judged by the God he had rejected. When Abijam died, his son Asa became king of Judah. Unlike his father and grandfather, Asa was a man who truly wanted to follow God with all his heart. He looked around his kingdom and saw all the idols and pagan worship places that had been built, and he decided to clean house. 2 Chronicles 14:25 describes Asa's reforms. "And Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord, his God. He took away the foreign altars and the high places, and broke down the pillars, and cut down the Asherim, and commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to keep the law and the commandment. He also took out of all the cities of Judah the high places and the incense altars, and the kingdom had rest under him." This was exactly what Judah needed. Asa wasn't just getting rid of obvious pagan idols, he was also tearing down the high places where people tried to worship God in the wrong way. He wanted his people to worship only at the temple in Jerusalem, just as God had commanded. The results were amazing. The kingdom had rest under Asa, meaning there was peace and prosperity. When a nation follows God's ways, he blesses them with security and success, but the peace didn't last forever. In the northern kingdom, a new king named Baasha had taken power, and he wasn't about to let Judah get too strong. 1 Kings 15:16 tells us, "And there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days." The endless cycle of fighting was continuing into another generation, even though Asa was trying to follow God, and even though Judah had won. That great victory at Mount Zemaraim, the two kingdoms still couldn't find peace. Baasha decided to try a new strategy. Instead of meeting Judah in open battle, he would strangle them economically. 1 Kings 15:17 explains his plan. "And Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and built Ramah. that he might permit no one to go out or come in to Asa king of Judah. Ramah was a town just 5 miles north of Jerusalem. By building a fortress there, Baasha could control the main road between Judah and the northern kingdoms. No merchants could travel to Jerusalem to trade. No pilgrims from the northern tribes could come to worship at the temple. Baasha was trying to isolate Judah and cut off their connections to the outside world. This was a smart military move, but it put Asa in a terrible position. He couldn't attack Ramah directly because it was too well fortified. He couldn't ignore it because it was choking off Judah's economy. He needed help, but where could he get it? Faced with Baasha's blockade at Ramah, King Asa made a decision that seemed smart at the time, but would have terrible consequences later. He decided to ask for help from Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. This wasn't just asking for advice or moral support. Asa was willing to pay Syria to attack Israel from the north, forcing Baasha to abandon Ramah and rush home to defend his own territory. 1 Kings 15:18-19 tells us what Asa did. Then Asa took all the silver and the gold that were left in the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and gave them into the hands of his servants. And King Asa sent them to Ben-Hadad, the son of Tabrimon, the son of Hezion, king of Syria, who lived in Damascus, saying, "There is a covenant between me and you, as there was between my father and your father. Behold, I am sending to you a present of silver and gold. Go, break your covenant with Baasha king of Israel, that he may withdraw from me." Think about what Asa was doing here. He was taking treasure from God's temple, gold and silver that was supposed to be used for worship, and giving it to a pagan king to hire him as a mercenary. He was also asking Ben-Hadad to break his treaty with Israel, which meant Asa was encouraging lying and betrayal, but the plan worked, at least in the short term. Verse 20 tells us, "And Ben-Hadad listened to King Asa, and sent the commanders of his armies against the cities of Israel, and conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel-Beth-Maacah, and all Cinneroth, with all the land of Naphtali." Syria attacked the northern part of Israel, capturing several important cities. Baasha had no choice but to abandon his fortress at Ramah and rush north to fight the Syrians. Asa's strategy had succeeded. The blockade was broken. 1 Kings 15:22 shows us what happened next. Then King Asa made a proclamation to all Judah, none was exempted, and they carried away the stones of Ramah and its timber, with which Baasha had been building, and with them King Asa built Geba of Benjamin and Mizpah. Asa didn't just tear down Baasha's fortress, he used the materials to build his own fortifications at Geba and Mizpah. These new forts would protect Judah's northern border and prevent Israel from trying the same trick again. But God wasn't happy with Asa's methods. 2 Chronicles 16:7-9 records what the prophet Hanani told the king. At that time Hanani the seer came to Asa king of Judah and said to him, "Because you relied on the king of Syria and did not rely on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Syria has escaped out of your hand. Were not the Ethiopians and the Libyans a huge army with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he gave them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless toward him. You have done foolishly in this, and from now on you will have wars." The prophet was reminding Asa of how God had given him victory over a huge Ethiopian army earlier in his reign. If God could defeat a 1,000,000-man army from Africa, why couldn't he handle Baasha's little fortress at Ramah? By hiring Syria instead of trusting God, Asa had missed an opportunity to see God's power and had instead made Syria stronger and more dangerous. The worst part was Hanani's final warning. "From now on you will have wars." Asa's alliance with Syria had solved one problem, but created many bigger ones. Foreign nations now knew they could play the Hebrew kingdoms against each other for profit. While Judah was dealing with Syrian alliances and border fortresses, the northern kingdom of Israel was falling apart from the inside. The fake religion that Jeroboam had created wasn't just leading people away from God. It was destroying the moral foundation that held society together. God had warned that Jeroboam's family would be destroyed because of his sins, and that prophecy came true in a brutal way. 1 Kings 15:27-28 tells the story. Baasha, the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar, conspired against him, and Baasha struck him down at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, for Nadab and all Israel were laying siege to Gibbethon. So Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa king of Judah and reigned in his place. Nadab was Jeroboam's son, and he had only been king for 2 years when Baasha murdered him. This wasn't a battle between two armies. This was an assassination, a betrayal by one of Nadab's own officers. The northern kingdom was learning that violence was the easiest way to change governments. But Baasha didn't stop with killing the king. Verse 29 shows us how complete his massacre was. And as soon as he was king, he killed all the house of Jeroboam. He left to the house of Jeroboam not one that breathed until he had destroyed it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. Baasha wiped out Jeroboam's entire family, men, women, children, everyone. This fulfilled the prophecy that Ahijah had given years earlier, but it also showed how brutal Israel's politics had become. Murder was now the normal way to start a new dynasty. You might think Baasha would learn from Jeroboam's mistakes, but he didn't. 1 Kings 15:34 tells us, "He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin which he made Israel to sin." Baasha kept the same fake religion, the same golden calves, the same corrupt priesthood. So God sent the same judgment on Baasha's family. The prophet Jehu delivered this message in 1 Kings 16:1-3. And the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha, saying, "Since I exalted you out of the dust and made you leader over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and have made my people Israel to sin, provoking me to anger with their sins, behold, I will utterly sweep away Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat." The same pattern repeated exactly. Baasha ruled for 24 years, then died naturally. His son Elah became king, but only lasted 2 years before being assassinated by his own chariot commander, Zimri. And just like before, the new king killed everyone in the previous royal family. But Zimri's reign was even shorter, only 7 days. When the army heard that Zimri had murdered the king, they declared their commander Omri as the new king and marched on the capital. Zimri was trapped in the palace and burned it down around himself rather than surrender. 1 Kings 16:15-18 summarizes this chaos. In the 27th year of Asa king of Judah, Zimri reigned 7 days in Tirzah. Now the troops were encamped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. And the troops who were encamped heard it said, "Zimri has conspired, and he has killed the king." Therefore all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. So Omri went up from Gibbethon, and all Israel with him, and they besieged Tirzah. And when Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the king's house and burned the king's house over him with fire and died. In less than 50 years, Israel had gone through 4 different dynasties, each one ending in murder and massacre. The kingdom that was supposed to be God's chosen people had become a place where violence was the only way to gain power. Down in Judah, King Asa's son Jehoshaphat was watching the chaos in the northern kingdom with growing concern. The constant violence and instability in Israel was making both Hebrew kingdoms look weak to their enemies. Foreign nations were starting to think that God's people were just another collection of warring tribes, no different from any other nation. Jehoshaphat was a godly king who wanted to follow God's ways, and he believed that meant trying to make peace with Israel. After all, they were still fellow Hebrews, still descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Maybe if the two kingdoms could stop fighting each other, they could work together again like in the days of David and Solomon. By this time, Omri's son, Ahab, had become king of Israel. Ahab was powerful and wealthy, and he had built a magnificent new capital city called Samaria. He also had a daughter named Athaliah, who was old enough to get married. Jehoshaphat came up with what seemed like a brilliant plan, a royal marriage that would unite the two kingdoms peacefully. His son Jehoram would marry Ahab's daughter Athaliah, creating a family bond between the royal houses of Judah and Israel. 2 Chronicles 18:1 tells us what happened. Now Jehoshaphat had great riches and honor, and he made a marriage alliance with Ahab. This seemed like a wonderful solution. Instead of war, there would be wedding celebrations. Instead of hatred, there would be family ties. The children of this marriage would be related to both royal families, giving them a reason to keep the peace. But there was a huge problem that Jehoshaphat didn't fully understand. Ahab wasn't just another Hebrew king. He was married to a woman named Jezebel, who worshipped the pagan god Baal. And Ahab's daughter Athaliah had grown up learning her mother's religion, not the faith of Abraham and Moses. 1 Kings 16:31-33 describes what Ahab was really like. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria, and Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. This means Athaliah wasn't just bringing political connections to Judah. She was bringing Baal worship. When she married Jehoram, she would influence him to abandon the God of Israel for the pagan gods of her family. The marriage alliance that was supposed to bring peace would instead bring spiritual poison into Judah's royal house. Later, Athaliah would try to destroy David's entire family line and set up Baal worship in Jerusalem itself. Jehoshaphat's peace initiative had failed before it even began. You can't make true peace by compromising with evil. The only way to have real peace is when both sides are following God's ways. While the Hebrew kingdom spent centuries fighting each other, a terrifying new power was rising in the east. The Assyrian Empire was growing stronger and more aggressive, every year swallowing up smaller nations one by one. Their army was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Disciplined, ruthless, and equipped with the latest weapons of war. The Assyrian kings watched the civil war between Israel and Judah with great interest. They saw how the constant fighting had weakened both kingdoms, draining their treasures and dividing their armies. What should have been one strong nation that could resist foreign invasion had become two weak kingdoms that were easy to manipulate. King Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria was especially clever at playing the Hebrew kingdoms against each other. 2 Kings 15:19-20 tells us about his first move against Israel. Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver that he might help him to confirm his hold on the royal power. And Menahem exacted the money from Israel, that is, from all the wealthy men, 50 shekels of silver from every man, to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned back and did not stay there in the land. Think about what was happening here. Israel was so weak from all their civil wars that they couldn't even fight off this first Assyrian attack. Instead, King Menahem had to pay a huge amount of silver, 1,000 talents, just to make the Assyrians go away. That's Like paying a bully to leave you alone, knowing he'll probably come back for more money later. But the worst part was how Menahem got this money. He taxed every wealthy man in Israel 50 shekels of silver. This wasn't just taking money from the royal treasury. This was forcing ordinary citizens to pay tribute to a foreign enemy. The people who should have been protected by their king were instead being robbed to pay off his failures. The Assyrians learned an important lesson from this encounter. The Hebrew kingdoms would pay tribute rather than fight. They were afraid of each other, afraid of losing their thrones, and afraid of the cost of war. This made them perfect targets for Assyrian manipulation. Soon, both Israel and Judah were sending tribute to Assyria on a regular basis. 2 Kings 16.78 shows us how King Ahaz of Judah also became an Assyrian puppet. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, "I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me." And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent a present to the king of Assyria. Ahaz was actually asking Assyria to attack his fellow Hebrews. He was so afraid of Israel and Syria that he invited a foreign empire to come and rescue him. He even took gold and silver from God's temple to pay for this rescue. The division between the kingdoms had become so bitter that they would rather trust foreign enemies than each other. The Assyrians were happy to help, for a price. They defeated Syria and Israel just as Ahaz wanted, but now Judah owed them tribute too. Both Hebrew kingdoms had become vassal states, sending their wealth to Assyria instead of using it to build up their own defenses. By the time Hoshea became king of Israel, the northern kingdom was trapped. They had been paying tribute to Assyria for years, and their treasury was almost empty. The people were tired of seeing their money go to foreign masters instead of being used to improve their own lives. Hoshea knew that something had to change, but he was caught between impossible choices. If he kept paying tribute, Israel would slowly bleed to death financially, but if he stopped paying, the Assyrians would come with their army and destroy the kingdom completely. In his desperation, Hoshea decided to try a dangerous gamble. He would make a secret alliance with Egypt and stop paying tribute to Assyria. Egypt was the only power in the region that might be strong enough to stand up to the Assyrian war machine. 2 Kings 17:4 tells us about this fateful decision. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Hoshea thought he was being clever by reaching out to Egypt in secret, but the Assyrians had spies everywhere. They discovered his plan before Egypt could send any real help. King Shalmaneser V of Assyria was furious that his vassal was trying to rebel, and he moved quickly to crush the uprising. The first thing the Assyrians did was capture Hoshea himself. The king of Israel was arrested and thrown into an Assyrian prison, leaving his kingdom without a leader just when they needed one most. This shows how completely the Assyrians dominated the region. They could just walk in and arrest a king whenever they wanted, but Hoshea's capture was only the beginning. The Assyrians had decided that Israel was too dangerous to leave alone. The northern kingdom had rebelled once, and they might rebel again. The only way to make sure this didn't happen was to destroy Israel completely. What made this situation even more tragic was that it could have been avoided. If Israel and Judah had stayed united, they would have been strong enough to resist Assyrian pressure. If they had trusted in God instead of foreign alliances, He might have protected them from their enemies. But centuries of civil war had left Israel weak, isolated, and desperate. Hoshea's alliance with Egypt was the last gasp of a dying kingdom. Egypt was too far away to provide real help, and they were more interested in using Israel as a buffer against Assyria than actually protecting them. The northern kingdom was about to pay the ultimate price for generations of bad decisions. With their king captured and their Egyptian allies nowhere to be found, the people of Israel faced the full fury of the Assyrian army. King Shalmaneser surrounded Samaria, the capital city, and began one of the longest and most brutal sieges in biblical history. 2 Kings 17:5 describes the beginning of the end. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and came up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years, 3 whole years. Think about what that meant for the people trapped inside the city. At first, they probably thought they could hold out until Egypt sent help or until the Assyrians got tired and went home. But as months turned into years, hope began to fade. Food became scarce, then rare, then almost impossible to find. People started dying from hunger and disease. The Assyrian siege was designed to break the people's will to fight. They surrounded the city completely, so no food or supplies could get in. They built siege engines to attack the walls, and they waited patiently for starvation to do most of their work for them. During those 3 terrible years, the people of Samaria had plenty of time to think about how they had gotten into this situation. Maybe some of them remembered the warnings that prophets had given about serving false gods. Maybe they thought about all the money they had wasted on civil wars instead of building stronger defenses, but it was too late for regrets. In 722 BC, after 3 years of suffering, Samaria finally fell. The Bible tells us in 2 Kings 17:6, "In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Halah, and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes." When the Assyrians conquered a city, they didn't just take it over, they emptied it out completely. They rounded up the surviving population and marched them hundreds of miles away to distant parts of their empire. This wasn't just conquest. This was cultural extinction. The 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were scattered across the Assyrian Empire, from modern-day Iraq to Iran. They were deliberately mixed in with other conquered peoples so they would lose their Hebrew identity and never be able to organize a rebellion. Families were split up, communities were destroyed, and the Hebrew language slowly disappeared among the exiles. 2 Kings 17:18 explains why this happened. "Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only." This wasn't just a military defeat, it was divine judgment. God had warned Israel for centuries through his prophets, but they had refused to listen. The northern kingdom, which had lasted for about 200 years, was gone forever. The 10 tribes became known as the lost tribes of Israel, because they disappeared into the Assyrian Empire and never returned as a distinct people. The Assyrians didn't leave the northern territory empty after they deported the Israelites. Empty. Land was useless land, and the Assyrian Empire was all about maximizing profit and control. So they brought in people from other parts of their empire to settle in what used to be Israel. 2 Kings 17:24 tells us about this population replacement. "And the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities." Think about what this meant. The promised land that God had given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was now being settled by pagans from all over the Assyrian Empire. Babylonians were living in towns where Hebrew families had worshipped God for generations. Foreigners were farming fields that had been passed down through Israelite families for centuries. But the Assyrians had made one big mistake. They didn't bring enough people to fill all the empty towns and villages. Much of the northern territory was left wild and dangerous, with wild animals moving into the abandoned settlements. Worse yet, these new settlers didn't know how to worship the God of Israel, and God was not happy about having his land filled with pagans. 2 Kings 17:25-26 describes what happened, and at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, "The nations that you have carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are killing them, because they do not know the law of the God of the land." The Assyrian king realized he had a problem. His new settlers were being killed by lions, and his local administrators told him it was because they weren't worshipping the local god properly. From the Assyrian point of view, every land had its own gods that needed to be respected, or there would be trouble. So the king came up with a solution that seemed logical to him. 2 Kings 17:27-28 tells us, "Then the king of Assyria commanded, 'Send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there, and let him go and dwell there and teach them the law of the God of the land.' So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord." One of the exiled Israelite priests was sent back to teach the new settlers how to worship God. But remember, this priest probably came from the corrupted northern kingdom, where they had been worshipping golden calves and mixing pagan practices with Hebrew religion for 200 years. The result was a complete religious mess. These foreign settlers started worshipping the God of Israel, but they also kept worshipping their own pagan gods from their original countries. 2 Kings 17:33 sums it up. "So they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away." Over time, these mixed populations began to intermarry with the few Hebrews who had been left behind. Their descendants became known as the Samaritans, a mixed race that combined Hebrew blood with foreign blood and Hebrew religion with pagan religion. When the Jews from Judah later returned from their own exile in Babylon, they would despise these Samaritans and refuse to have anything to do with them. The division that had started with Rehoboam and Jeroboam had created a new kind of hatred that would last for centuries. With the northern kingdom destroyed and its people scattered, Judah suddenly found itself in a terrifying position. For 200 years, Israel had served as a buffer between Judah and the great empires of the north. Even though the two kingdoms had been enemies, Israel had still absorbed some of the pressure from foreign invaders. Now that buffer was gone. Judah was alone, facing the full might of whatever empire wanted to dominate the region. And unfortunately for them, an even more powerful empire than Assyria was rising in the east, Babylon. The Babylonians had conquered the Assyrians and taken over their empire. Now they were looking south toward the small kingdoms that had survived. Assyrian rule. Egypt was still a major power in the region, and the land between Egypt and Babylon became a constant battleground as these two superpowers fought for control. Judah was caught right in the middle of this conflict. They were too small to fight either Egypt or Babylon directly, but they were too important geographically to be ignored. Whoever controlled Judah controlled the main road between Asia and Africa. King Josiah of Judah tried to stay independent by not taking sides in the conflict between Egypt and Babylon. But 2 Kings 23:29 shows us how impossible this was. In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria, to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him, and Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo when he saw him. Josiah tried to stop the Egyptian army from marching through his territory to fight the Babylonians, but he was killed in the attempt. This shows how completely the great powers dominated the region. They would march their armies wherever they wanted, and any small kingdom that got in the way would be crushed. After Josiah's death, Judah became a puppet state, first of Egypt, then of Babylon. 2 Kings 24:1 tells us, "In his days Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. Just like Israel before them, Judah was forced to pay tribute to a foreign empire, and just like Israel, they eventually tried to rebel when the burden became too heavy. But Judah had learned nothing from Israel's destruction. They made the same mistakes, trusted the same unreliable allies, and ignored the same warnings from God's prophets. The difference was that Judah was facing an even more powerful enemy than Israel had faced. The Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar was larger, richer, and more militarily advanced than Assyria had ever been. And Judah was trying to resist them without any help from other Hebrew kingdoms. If David's united kingdom had still existed, it might have been strong enough to maintain independence from Babylon, at least for a while. The combined armies of all 12 tribes, along with their accumulated wealth and strong fortifications, could have put up a real fight. But that unity was long gone. Judah stood alone, weakened by centuries of civil war, drained by paying tribute to foreign empires, and surrounded by enemies on all sides. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was not as patient as the Assyrians had been. When Judah's king Jehoiakim stopped paying tribute and tried to rebel, the Babylonian response was swift and brutal. The first Babylonian attack came in 605 BC when they captured Jerusalem and took many of the nobles and skilled workers back to Babylon as prisoners. Among these captives was a young man named Daniel, who would become famous for his faithfulness to God in a foreign land. But this was just the beginning. When Jehoiakim's son Jehoiakim continued the rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar came back with an even larger army. 2 Kings 24:10-14 describes what happened. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself and his mother, and his servants, and his officials, and his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign, and carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which Solomon king of Israel had made, as the Lord had foretold. He carried away all Jerusalem, and all the officials, and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. This second deportation was much more severe than the first. Nebuchadnezzar took not just the royal family, but also 10,000 of Judah's most important people, government officials, military leaders, skilled craftsmen, and anyone else who might be able to organize a rebellion. He also stripped the temple of all its remaining treasures. The golden vessels that Solomon had made for worship were cut up and carried away to Babylon. The house that was supposed to be the center of worship for all 12 tribes was being systematically looted by pagans. But even this wasn't enough to teach Judah's leaders humility. Nebuchadnezzar appointed Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's uncle, as the new king, hoping he would be grateful enough to stay loyal. But after 9 years of rule, Zedekiah also tried to rebel. This final rebellion was the last straw for Nebuchadnezzar. 2 Kings 25:1-2 tells us, "And in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And they built siege works all around it. So the city was besieged till the 11th year of King Zedekiah. For almost 2 years, Jerusalem was under siege. Like Samaria before it, the city was slowly starved into submission. The people inside ate anything they could find, including things that God's law said were unclean. When the city finally fell in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar showed no mercy. 2 Kings 25:8-10 describes the complete destruction. In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, the servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down, and all the army of the Chaldeans, who were with the captain of the guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. The pattern was the same as what had happened to Israel, but even more complete. The temple was burned, the palace was destroyed, the city walls were torn down, and most of the remaining population was marched off to exile in Babylon. The kingdom of Judah, which had lasted about 350 years, was finished. Like their northern brothers before them, the people of Judah would spend the next 70 years in foreign captivity, wondering if God had forgotten his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of all the destruction that Nebuchadnezzar brought to Jerusalem, nothing was more heartbreaking than what happened to Solomon's temple. This wasn't just another building, it was the place where God had chosen to put his name, the center of worship for the Hebrew people, the symbol of God's presence among his chosen nation. For nearly 400 years, the temple had stood on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. Priests had offered sacrifices there every morning and evening. Pilgrims had come from all over the Hebrew kingdoms to worship during the great festivals. It was the one place that all 12 tribes were supposed to share, regardless of their political differences. But the civil war between Israel and Judah had corrupted even this holy place. When Jeroboam set up his golden calves in Dan and Bethel, he had effectively declared that people didn't need to come to Jerusalem to worship God. The northern tribes had stopped making pilgrimages to the temple, depriving it of both worshippers. And financial support, even worse, some of the kings of Judah had brought pagan idols into the temple itself. They had set up altars to foreign gods in the same building where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. The house that was supposed to be dedicated only to the true God had become contaminated with false worship. 2 Kings 25:13-17 gives us the painful details of the temple's destruction. And the pillars of bronze that were in the house of the Lord, and the stands and the bronze sea that were in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans broke in pieces and carried the bronze to Babylon. And they took away the pots and the shovels, and the snuffers and the dishes for incense, and all the vessels of bronze used in the temple service, the fire pans also, and the bowls. What was of gold, the captain of the guard took away as gold, and what was of silver as silver. As for the 2 pillars, the 1 sea, and the stands that Solomon had made for the house of the Lord, the bronze of all these vessels was beyond weight. The height of the 1 pillar was 18 cubits, and on it was a capital of bronze. The height of the capital was 3 cubits. A latticework and pomegranates, all of bronze, were all around the capital, and the 2nd pillar had the same, with the latticework. Every piece of metal in the temple was either carried away or broken up for easier transport. The 2 massive bronze pillars that had stood at the entrance, Jachin and Boaz, were smashed to pieces. The bronze sea where the priests washed themselves was destroyed. All the golden and silver vessels used in worship were stolen. But the worst part wasn't just the looting, it was the burning. Verse 9 had told us that the Babylonians burned the house of the Lord. The beautiful cedar wood that Solomon had imported from Lebanon went up in flames. The gold plating on the walls melted and ran down like water. The curtains and tapestries were reduced to ash. When the fire finally died out, nothing was left but blackened stone walls and piles of rubble. The place where God's glory had once appeared in a cloud was now open to the sky. Wild animals would soon be nesting where the priests had once sung God's praises. The destruction of the temple was more than just a military victory for Babylon. It was a theological crisis for the Hebrew people. How could God allow his own house to be destroyed? Did this mean that the Babylonian gods were stronger than the God of Israel? Had the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob been broken forever? Some of the Hebrew captives in Babylon would spend decades wrestling with these questions. They would sit by the rivers of Babylon and weep when they remembered Jerusalem. They would hang up their harps because they couldn't bear to sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land. What had started almost 1,000 years earlier with God's promise to Abraham had seemingly come to a tragic end. God had told Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that they would be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. For a while, it had looked like that promise was coming true. Under David and Solomon, the 12 tribes had been united into a powerful kingdom that dominated the entire region. Foreign nations had come to Jerusalem to see the wisdom of Solomon and the glory of God's house. Israel had truly been a light to the nations. But the division between Israel and Judah had changed everything. Instead of being a blessing to the world, the Hebrew people had become an example of what happens when God's people turn away from his ways. Instead of showing the nations how to live in peace and prosperity, they had spent centuries destroying each other. Now, in 586 BC, both Hebrew kingdoms were gone. The 10 northern tribes had been scattered across the Assyrian Empire and had lost their identity as God's people. The southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin were in exile in Babylon, wondering if they would ever see their homeland again. 2 Kings 25:21 sums up the catastrophe in just a few words. So, Judah was taken into exile out of its land. The promised land that God had given to their ancestors was now occupied by foreigners. The covenant that God had made with Moses on Mount Sinai seemed to be broken beyond repair. But the scattering went deeper than just physical exile. The unity that had made the Hebrew people special was completely destroyed. The 12 tribes that were supposed to work together as one nation were now spread across multiple empires, speaking different languages and losing touch with their common heritage. Some of the exiles in Babylon would eventually return to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. But they would never again be the united kingdom that David had created. The northern tribes would never return as distinct groups. The Samaritans who lived in the old northern territory would be rejected by the returning Jews. The division that had started with Rehoboam and Jeroboam would become a permanent part of Hebrew identity. Even when Jesus came to earth centuries later, the effects of this division were still visible. He would encounter Samaritans who were despised by the Jews. He would speak about the lost sheep of the house of Israel who were scattered among the nations. He would weep over Jerusalem because the people still didn't understand what would bring them peace. The story that had begun with such promise, one people chosen by God to be a light to the world, had ended in tragedy. The division between Israel and Judah had not only destroyed two kingdoms, but had shattered God's original plan for his chosen people to demonstrate his glory to all the nations. If this journey through biblical history has opened your eyes to the power of unity and the danger of division, I want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming videos exploring more incredible stories from Scripture. And please share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Whether it's a friend struggling with division in their own life, a family member interested in biblical history, or someone who's never heard these stories before, your share could change their perspective forever. What lesson from the conflict between Israel and Judah spoke to you the most? Drop a comment below and let's continue this conversation. I read every single comment and love hearing your thoughts on these ancient stories that still speak to us today. Until next time, remember that God's plans for unity and restoration are always stronger than human pride and division. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.